Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, I want to take, a 48 hours removed peek at the Wolves-Mavs game. A couple of quick things related to that from the other night. And then I want to look at some catch-all metrics again and just kind of see where Karl-Anthony Towns stacks up against some of the league's best players. Finally, we'll preview the big Wolves-Suns game on Wednesday night at Target Center. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. I'm also the editor of Dunking with Wolves, the Timberwolves site on the Fansided Network. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy Timberwolves game day and happy hump day. The Timberwolves play the Phoenix Suns this evening, the NBA's best team. Back at Target Center, though. The Wolves are back at Target Center for a couple in a row, which is good. I mean, the schedule's obviously in a really rough part. We'll talk about that later. We'll talk about Wolves Suns. Plenty of stuff to get to here today. First of all, though, thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms from Apple to Google, Spotify, Odyssey, anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can find this program. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T Wolves and at B Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN. What I want to do today is take a peek back at Wolves-Mavs on Monday. It was one of the best games of the year, just in terms of entertainment value. Obviously, the magnitude of the game for the Wolves, given that they entered the game tied with Denver for the 6th spot, just a game and a half behind Dallas for the 5 spot, who is virtually tied, very close to tied with Utah for the 4 spot. So, I mean, just how close the teams 4 through 7 in the Western Conference are. Obviously, that game was really important. It was a fun game. It was a one-possession game. It came down to the wire. And while the Wolves came up on the wrong side of it, I think there's plenty to talk about still with it. And I want to take a peek back at a couple of key things, a day or two removed, just kind of thinking about that, looking back at, and also the NBA's last 2-minute report came out. So I think that's reasonable to talk about, given how upset the Wolves were about the officiating following the game. So we'll talk about all that here in the first segment of the show. And then I want to get into a little bit more catch-all metric talk. The other day, I spent some time, I think it was Monday, on ESPN's real plus minus metric and how well the Wolves rated in that. I want to talk about a couple of other metrics and kind of the Andy Bailey on Twitter puts out like an average of the catch-all metrics and where the league's best players are. So I want to talk about Towns' place there as well. And then we'll finish the show today by talking about Wolves Suns, what's happened the first 2 times these teams matched up, the injury report, what to expect on Wednesday. And so that'll come up here at the end of the show. All right, so let's kick this thing off by talking Wolves Mavs again. I don't want to beat a dead horse with any of my key takeaways from the game Monday. The game Monday, the podcast Tuesday. So if you want to go back and hear my immediate reaction to that game, I start every post-game pod with the biggest overall takeaway and then have some kind of sub takeaways beyond that as well. But I had a couple of other things that I wanted to talk through. Let's start with the last 2-minute report because I talked about this on the post-game pod. I didn't actually think the Wolves got that bad of a draw in terms of officiating. I didn't think they clearly had the short end of the stick. I mean, if you pay attention to Mavs Twitter or NBA Twitter in general, I think the consensus was the refs were bad, and maybe not surprisingly, but the Mavs felt the officials gave them the short end of the stick, as the Wolves felt the same way on their side of things. And frankly, I tend to agree that this thing was just bad on both sides, and I don't think the officiating was that bad against the Wolves. I think it was more the totality of how Karl-Anthony Towns was officiated, and we could say that almost every night because Cat gets absolutely pummeled, as evidenced by his forearm contusion that he's dealing with. But we talked about this all season. Go back and watch in some ways, and again, I've made this comparison before. I know it's dangerous every time I say it that this is going to get misconstrued. I'm not saying that Karl-Anthony Towns is Shaquille O'Neal. However, the way that Towns is officiated is disproportionate to how other bigs in the league are officiated, similar to the way that Shaq was officiated, when guys would just bounce off of him. And because Shaq was so big, officials wouldn't call fouls because these guys were just kind of bouncing off him. And it was like, whatever, until they literally were hack-a-shacking him and grabbing his arms, and you couldn't avoid calling a foul. The way Karl-Anthony Towns is officiated is similar because he plays like a guard and he doesn't get similar in the results, not in the method, because it's more that he plays like a guard. So on the perimeter, he's not getting the same, basically the hand check foul calls that other guys are getting. Excuse me. He's not getting those hand check foul calls that other guys are getting, that guards are getting. And then when he gets into the paint, when he's driving like a guard would do in a face-up situation from the perimeter, he doesn't get same thing. He's not getting those body calls. If guys put two hands on him, it should be an automatic foul. He doesn't get those calls. And then he gets into the paint and he's simply stronger than most of the time. If it's a power forward guarding him, which you've seen a lot of, they mostly bounce off of him, similar to how anybody would bounce off of Shaq, including 7 foot plus 300-pound other centers. But like anybody that's guarding Karl-Anthony Towns, for the most part, unless you're talking like a real big, like a Rudy Gobert or somebody like that, which even when the Wolves play the Jazz, that doesn't usually happen with frequency. He's still not getting those foul calls. So I think the totality of the way that Towns is officiated is one thing. But I don't think down the stretch the Wolves got the short end of the stick, and neither did the league. The league announced their last 2-minute report, and I don't think I've talked about the last 2-minute report all season. So if you're new to the show, I don't talk about officiating very often, but the Wolves, especially Chris Finch and a couple of the players that spoke after the game, were pretty fixated on it after Monday's game. So I thought it was worth talking about. And there weren't any calls that did not go in the Wolves' favor in the final 2 minutes of the last 2-minute report that would have favored the Wolves or that would have been against the Wolves and went the wrong way. There were actually two committed that would have benefited the Mavericks had they flipped the other way. So the Mavs actually got the short end in the final 2 minutes. And the one that bothered me the most was the take foul on Luka Doncic. And the league called that a correct call because, again, letter of the law, Doncic, it was like a finger or two that went down on Beverly's wrist or whatever it was, or part of his hand. And it was, again, letter of the law, a foul. I think the frustration that the Wolves had was that a literal touch foul like that, like it wasn't even a whole hand. It was a couple of fingers that fouled Patrick Beverly. That sort of contact isn't called all game. But then at the end of the game, as I mentioned on Tuesday's show, there's kind of this, I'm sure the Mavs went to the officials and said, hey, we're going to try and take a foul here. So there's any contact at all, they're going to call it. In any end of game situation like that, if you give the official the heads up that you're trying to do that, then of course on the very next free throw, you could have argued that I think it was I can't remember if it was, I think it was Maxi Kleber who just kind of backed up into Towns and fell on him to try and dislodge him. The league called that a correct no call after the game. It said that they, quote, engage and disengage with one another during rebounding. I understand why there was no call there, because if you're the Mavs and that's called, you're like, why are you calling that at that point in the game? If I'm the Wolves, I feel the same way about the Doncic take foul. And both of those were considered correct by the league. Again, I understand it, but it underscores it. The officiating was not what to fixate on Monday. It was a fun game. The Wolves didn't play that well overall, but they also didn't play a terrible game. They just played a good team. Neither the Mavs or the Wolves were outstanding. They both came into the game with good defensive game plans. They both adjusted throughout the game. And if you're the Wolves, you're mad about the blown layups, and you're maybe mad generally with the way Karl-Anthony Towns was officiated. Also, point of attack defense wasn't very good. And my other takeaway I wanted to mention from that game is Anthony Edwards. I talked a little bit towards the end of Tuesday's postgame pod from Monday's game about how the Wolves ended up with Jalen Noel, Anthony Edwards, D'Angelo Russell guarding the ball in crunch time on Monday, which isn't typically what you want. But the idea being you're going to switch everything anyway, and those guys can at least, with their length, put some pressure on the ball in the perimeter. And then you can, with no Jaden McDaniels, there aren't that many other options, right? You didn't necessarily want Jared Vanderbilt, a banged up Jared Vanderbilt on an island out there on the perimeter. They probably weren't going to insert a cold Josh Okogie you hadn't played all game. So I understand the thinking. And then you can get them involved in ball screen action. You can get Patrick Beverly involved out on the perimeter to kind of, blitz the ball. But Anthony Edwards actually did a really good job. And we've seen that this season. He got a rap last year as a bad defender, which is fair. He was not a good defender, especially on the ball as a rookie. And he's had his moments this year where he's really struggled too. But he actually defended the point of attack extremely well down the stretch on Monday. He completely stopped Luka Doncic at one point. Unfortunately, it was the possession that led to an offensive rebound for the Mavs that they ultimately scored on their second chance at it. But the ball pressure that Edwards was able to put on with his length, with his lateral quickness, if he applies himself to one-on-one defense, which he usually does nowadays, he's actually not a bad defender. It's the gambling that he occasionally that happened too. There was another possession late where he was on Doncic. He reached, and the second he reached, Doncic turned and whipped a pass to somebody in the corner for, I think it was Finney Smith, for a wide open three. And it was the moment that Edwards kind of just gambled just a little bit. And those things, like, he could get away with that in college. You could get away with it against, slower perimeter players. But if you're guarding a truly, star like a Luka, you can't gamble like that. And he still does that occasionally and help defense in the passing lanes. Although for the most part, he makes good decisions there. So I wanted to underscore that because I thought it was really impressive looking back at what he did in the final couple of minutes. Okay. Next, what I want to do is I want to get to catch-all metrics and spend just a couple of minutes looking at Karl-Anthony Towns' place among the league's best players in regard to those catch-alls. First, though, let's talk about our friends over at Prize Picks. All right, NBA fans, are you looking for a daily fantasy option for the NBA? Then you need to try the award-winning app Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. I love Prize Picks. I know you will too. It's super easy to use. Basically, what it is, you just pick 2 to 5 players, and you pick an over/under on their projections. You can win up to 10 times on every entry, and it's just you versus the projected number. So it's not you versus like a professional, somebody who plays DFS professionally. But the great thing is you can do it really quickly. It's 60 seconds or less. It's super easy. Prize Picks is safe, offers fast withdrawals. The award-winning app is on both the App Store and Google Play. And Prize Picks offers any app or any prop, you could think of, from points scored to rebounds, steals. And the best part about Prize Picks, the absolute best part, is you can do mixed sport entries. So this week, with college basketball's biggest tournament happening, you can take the over on, I don't know, let's say on Friday when the Timberwolves play the Mavs, you could take the over on Karl-Anthony Towns points or the under on Luka Doncic assists or maybe turnovers. I'm not sure if turnovers are in there for Friday or not, but you could maybe take the over on Doncic turnovers, and you could take the over on pick your favorite player from your favorite college basketball team on Friday that's playing as part of the next round. During football season, you can go college football, NFL, baseball's about to start. You could go cross sport with NBA and baseball, soccer, MMA, really any sport is on there. And now for a limited time, PrizePicks has an exclusive no-brainer of an offer for all of our listeners. Users of PrizePicks get $50 free if a player in your very first PrizePicks entry scores a single point. You just have to use the promo code NBA. That's right. This is an exclusive offer available to Locked On listeners only. Sign up today and you use the code NBA for $50 for free if a player in your first PrizePicks entry scores a single point. Thanks again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen each and every day. A reminder that for your next listen, you can check out the Locked On Now podcast, nightly recaps of every NBA game with analysis from our local experts. It's free and available wherever you listen to podcasts. For me, it's the best way to get caught up. If I'm watching the Wolves game and not watching the league as a whole on any given night, this is the best way to just kind of get a sense for what happened the night before. It's better than just, scrolling Twitter, perusing box scores, watching highlight shows. Locked On Now is the best way to get caught up. For each local expert is going to spend 60 to 90 seconds breaking down the game, and it's quick, bite-sized snapshots of what happened. But it's intelligent, right? It's not just looking at a box score. So be sure to check out Locked On Now. Okay, let's talk catch-all metric. So we talked about ESPN Real Plus Minus the other day because that's my favorite catch-all metric. And then actually, I guess this was the day before, so this won't include Monday's game. But Andy Bailey, who is a pretty good a good follow on Twitter, he writes for Bleacher Report and has reported on the Jazz primarily, I think, in the past. But he does this thing where every now and again he'll pull all the catch-all metrics. He'll average their ranks in the catch-all metrics, which is the best way to do this. It's every NBA player with 500 plus minutes. He does it for cumulative versions of all the catch-alls as well as the average of all the catch-alls. The 5 metrics that he considers are box plus minus, Raptor estimated plus minus, LeBron, which is the one over at our friends at B-Ball Index, and then game score per 36 minutes, which is a basketball reference metric. So he takes all the ranks in those metrics, averages their ranks, and then gets a list of who essentially should be the top 30 players in the league. It's a pretty interesting list. It's, again, not really all that surprising. The first list is per 36 as well as cumulative. And I want to talk about where Karl-Anthony Towns ranks. And and why I think it's really interesting. So number one is Nikola Jokic. In fact, he's first in all these ranks except for one. So his average rank is 1.1, which is just insane. It shows far and away that he really should be winning his second consecutive MVP award. And by the way, I love a Towns Jokic battle as much as anybody. And 3 or 4 years ago, I was the first person advocating for Towns being a better player than Jokic. But the last couple of years, Nikola Jokic is unbelievable. And look at that Mavs team. Obviously, no Jamal Murray, no Michael Porter Jr. That roster should not be as good as they are. I mean, hats off to Michael Malone and hats off to Nikola Jokic for how good that team has been. Um, I mean, these metrics suggest he's been the best player in the league by a fairly wide margin. I would argue that the traditional, like, oh, how much help does he have? That sort of a look at it. Uh, Hard to argue against Jokic in my mind as MVP. I don't care that his team is in sixth in the West and not in first or second. You look at a Joel Embiid or a Giannis, guys whose teams are doing better. You could also argue for Steph Curry, given how bad the Warriors have been now in his absence. Early in the season, he was kind of the odds-on favorite over the first few weeks. And I mean, if you want to buy that argument, who's most important to their team, I mean, I think you could argue Jokic and Curry and Giannis would be the top three, and Embiid would clearly be fourth on that list. At any rate, that's not what this is. That's not what I want to spend my time on here. Jokic is number one, Giannis is two, Embiid is three, and pretty easily three. Embiid is third actually in all five of those metrics. He ranks third. The average is a clean 3.0. And then there's a drop to number four. Steph Curry has an average rank of 6.7. Then LeBron at five, Jason Tatum at six. You could make a similar argument. I'm not at all saying he should win MVP, but given the rest of the Celtics roster and how poorly they started the season to where they are now, Jason Tatum has had a phenomenal year. Luka Doncic is seven, which is a little higher than I would have expected. Trae Young is eight. Same thing there, a little higher than I would have expected. Rudy Gobert, nine. Same thing there. Kevin Durant, 10, which is lower, excuse me, lower than I would have expected. But there he is at number 10. Jimmy Butler, 11. DeJounte Murray at 12. Those seem about right to me. Karl-Anthony Towns ranks 13th in the NBA. And, before the season, I was referencing Towns as a top 25 NBA player. At times, I've said he's top 20. I think it's pretty clear, and this backs it up. He's a top 15 player at this point in the league. I mean, look at the guys right behind him. John Morant, Chris Paul's at 15, Donovan Mitchell, 16, Jarrett Allen actually tied with Donovan Mitchell for 16, Devin Booker at 18, Drew Holiday at 19, and Fred VanVleet at 20. Of the guys right behind him, who would you put in front of him? Maybe Devin Booker. I wouldn't put John Morant in front of Towns. I think Morant is he obviously. I wouldn't put Morant ahead of Karl-Anthony Towns on a list of league's best players. I just wouldn't. I think he's got more help in the in terms of Jared Jackson and that roster generally, as deep as Wolves roster is, the Grizzlies roster is better. And so you could use that to kind of, again, that traditional argument of who's got more help. So I wouldn't put Morant ahead of Towns. You could argue about Chris Paul. You could argue about Donovan Mitchell. I wouldn't put Devin Booker ahead of Towns, but I'd understand if you'd want to. I would probably slide Towns ahead of DeJounte Murray. I would probably slide Towns ahead of Rudy Gobert. I certainly would. And possibly Trae Young. So in my mind, Towns is the 10th, 11th, maybe 12th best player in the league. And before the season, I think I was somewhere in the 16 to 18 range. Was kind of my thought process when we went through the player rank. Everybody does their player rankings back in like September. And I was kind of in that range with Towns. But I think very clearly he's a top 15 player. You could argue him as high as 10th, maybe even 9th league wide now. I mean, Jokic, Giannis, Embiid, Curry, LeBron, I guess Tatum, Durant. I mean, that maybe Jimmy Butler, that puts Towns 9th. That seems about right to me. Those are about the only players you clearly put ahead of Karl-Anthony Towns in terms of best players league wide. There's a couple players on this list that are surprising, but it's just the way that some of these catch-all metrics work. Like a Jakob Poeltl, obviously he's a really good defender. He is a good rebounder. He's an efficient offensive player, but nobody thinks Jakob Poeltl is the 26th best player in the league. Robert Williams at number 30. Obviously, a lot of the same stuff applies there. But at any rate, I think this is a fun exercise. You look at the top 20, there's really no argument that those guys in some order are the top 20 players in the league, at least in terms of guys who have been healthy for most of the season. So obviously no Paul George, no Kawhi Leonard, there's injured players are clearly missing from this list. But you look at the league today, and this is a pretty good way to evaluate overall league talent and the best players. Okay, I want to close the show by talking Wolves Suns on Wednesday. The Wolves haven't seen the Suns here in almost 2 months. They've played them twice already this season. So I want to peek back at what happened in those games, check in on what the Suns have been up to lately, and what we can expect in Wolves Suns on Wednesday. So we're going to do that here next. First, though, let's talk about our friends over at Built Bar. This is the time of year, we're now like a little more, or basically 3 months into the season, or into the year, not the season, that I've pretty much given up on all my New Year's resolutions. And frankly, a lot of us did quite several weeks ago. But this year, I'm sticking to my resolution to eat right, thanks to Built Bar. It almost feels like it's not really a resolution though, because I actually enjoy eating them. Have you tried Built Puffs? If you're not, you're missing out on one of Built Bar's best tasty bars. By the way, they just released brownie batter Built Puffs yesterday on Tuesday. I need to buy mine. I'm going to buy some today. I cannot wait. Built Puffs are fantastic, and I love brownie batter flavor anything. So this is absolutely going to be delicious. If you haven't had Built Puffs, you need to. They're the first ever protein infused marshmallow. They're fluffy, they're marshmallowy, they're not just a protein bar. They're a treat, and they're covered in 100% real chocolate. In addition to the new brownie batter flavor, you can get yummy cinnamony churro, coconut marshmallow, banana cream pie. They're all delicious. They're all covered in 100% real chocolate. You can go to built.com and scroll down to the macros chart. You'll be blown away by how healthy these bars are. And remember, they taste delicious. All Built Bars are high protein, low calorie, high fiber, low carb. Most Built Bars have only 130 calories per bar, just 4 grams of sugar and 4 grams of net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to a candy bar, which usually has around 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. From mint brownie to coconut almond, plenty of new delicious flavors as well all the time. They're all great. If you think a flavor might be good, they'll if Built thinks a flavor might be good, they'll make it. It will be delicious and it will be good for you. And really, they're all about the taste. They make the bars taste delicious first, and then they figure out how to make it healthy. And I don't know how they do it, but they truly do pull it off every single time. Go to built.com, use promo code LOCKED15. You'll get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCK15. By the way, that's the promo code I use every time I order, LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. All right, let's talk Wolves Suns. The Timberwolves haven't seen the Suns since the end of January. They played them once way back in it was like mid-November. The Timberwolves played the Suns, and it played them tough. It was kind of an ugly game, 99-96 back in Minnesota, mid-November. That was a game the Wolves were within 1 at halftime. They were only down 4 at the start of the fourth quarter. And I mean, the game was kind of a defensive struggle, kind of a lack of shooting early in the game. Then the fourth quarter is when the offenses finally showed up. For the Suns, I mean, Mikal Bridges only scored 7 points, made 2 shots in this game. It was all about Devin Booker, who got to the line at will against the Timberwolves in this one, which has really kind of been a theme all season for Wolves opponents, especially perimeter players against the Wolves. Karl-Anthony Towns had 35 and 13, but he committed 7 turnovers and 5 fouls in this game. There was in this game, the Wolves they were basically at full strength. They had played a short rotation, though. Only 8 guys played in this game for Minnesota. Josh Okogie was one of them. Taurean Prince did not play, was not in the rotation at the moment. He had struggled to start the season. Jordan McLaughlin, Jalen Noel not in the rotation. The Wolves starting lineup was still their preferred starting lineup at the time. But they fell short by 3 to the Suns in that one in what was more of a defensive struggle. And then the Timberwolves played the Suns at the end of January. And the Wolves did not have D'Angelo Russell in this game. They did not have Patrick Beverley. So Josh Okogie did play 13 minutes off the bench, was part of the rotation in this game. And this was nearly a wire-to-wire Suns win. Although the Wolves were in it, they only lost by 10. And it was really kind of a deficit that hovered in that 8 to 12 range for much of the game. Ant had 27 points, 10 assists, 5 rebounds, 4 steals in that game. Karl-Anthony Towns had 23, 9, and 5. Again, no D'Lo and no Patrick Beverley. Jalen Noel actually started in that game. And the Wolves at the time were just a game below 500. This was kind of right when they were starting to play a lot better and played the Suns tough in this one. Devin Booker had 29 and 9. Chris Paul had 21 and 14. Bismack Biyombo, there was no DeAndre Ayton in this game. Bismack Biyombo had 14 and 12. So obviously we have to consider no Ayton, no D'Lo, and no Patrick Beverley. So both teams are a little bit shorthanded in that one. In terms of injury report for this one, the only player on the Timberwolves injury report is Karl-Anthony Towns. Well, besides Jaden McDaniels, who's obviously out with the ankle issue. Towns is considered questionable with the forearm contusion. He was questionable Saturday and Monday and played in both of those games. I can't imagine he's going to want to miss coming back to Target Center for Wednesday night against the defending Western Conference champions. As for the Suns, no Chris Paul. Of course, he's been out now for several weeks with the thumb issue. No Cam Johnson. He's been out for, I believe this is his 10th consecutive missed game with the quad issue. Frank Kaminsky's been out really since the start of the year. So they're missing three rotation guys. Obviously, one of their best players in Chris Paul, a very key rotation player, and somebody, especially with no Chris Paul, who had been taking on a bigger role even in Cam Johnson. He scored like 38 points in his last game before the injury. Cam Johnson did. So no Cam Johnson, no Chris Paul, and no Frank Kaminsky for the Suns. So this is certainly a winnable game for Minnesota, but of course, Phoenix is still Phoenix. They've won 5 straight. They lost to the Raptors, I guess, just prior to the winning streak. So, they're obviously beatable, especially without Chris Paul and without Cam Johnson. But DeAndre Ayton's having a fantastic season. And obviously, you still got to deal with Devin Booker and Mikal Bridges and, just a relatively deep roster with some really high-end talent in terms of Booker, Paul, and Ayton. So even without Chris Paul, it's going to be tough sledding for Minnesota. The profile of the Suns, by the way, and I know I've talked about this when they've played them each of the other 2 times, is so unique. For having the league's 3rd best offense, the Suns are 27th in free throw rate and they're 27th in three-point rate. And in today's NBA, everybody for the last decade at least, everybody's been talking about free throws and three-pointers. The most efficient and easiest ways to score are shoot more threes, get to the free throw line more often, obviously shoot at the rim a lot. And usually free throw attempts and rim attempts kind of go hand in hand. Well, the Suns don't get to the free throw line very often. They're 4th lowest in the NBA in free throw rate, 27th in free throw rate, and same thing with three-point attempts, 27th. Now, when they get to the line and when they shoot three-pointers, they make them. They're 5th in three-point percentage as a team, and they're 6th in free throw percentage as a team. 36.7% as a team from outside the arc and over 80% as a team from the free throw line. So they make their attempts when they get there, and that's obviously a huge part of it. They play a lot in the mid-range. That's a function of having Chris Paul as your primary ball handler. Obviously, Devin Booker shoots a lot more threes now than he did early in his career, but he is very comfortable shooting from the mid-range as well. Their best players, Chris Paul, 1/3 of his shots come between 10 and 16 feet. Again, he's out for this game, but that's Chris Paul's a big part of why their profile is where it is. Devin Booker, 22% of his shots come from 10 to 16 feet from the basket. And each of those guys are between 15 and 20% of their shots coming from 16 feet out to the 3-point line. DeAndre Ayton on the flip side, 40% of his shots come at the rim, and 57% of his shots, 57.2% of his shots come from within 16 feet of the rim. Sorry, I flipped that. 34% of his shots actually come at the rim. 40% come from within 10 feet. So what I meant to say was 74.5%, basically 3/4 of his shots come within 10 feet of the rim. And more than 1/3 of them coming within 3 feet of the rim. So DeAndre Ayton, obviously pick and roll game with Chris Paul. They can run that with, Elfrid Payton. They run it with Devin Booker. He's going to get his attempts at the rim. DeAndre Ayton is the guy that the Wolves have to look out for. And again, he didn't play last time. Karl-Anthony Towns had a big game. Towns versus Ayton is going to be a ton of fun to try and see those guys go at it. And Towns has to stay out of foul trouble if the Wolves are going to win this game. That's maybe the most important thing. And I've been saying that a lot lately. That's kind of the key for the Wolves, right? If Towns can stay out of foul trouble, if Ant could show up, which he seems to do against the Suns. Remember, he had the 40-plus point game against them last year. If Ant shows up, if Towns stays out of foul trouble, this will be a competitive game. The Wolves have a legit shot at winning this one. Again, no Chris Paul, no Cam Johnson, but we're also talking about a team that's 58-14. It is by far the best team in the league this season. So it should be a ton of fun on Wednesday night. We'll, of course, do the post-game pod, and that'll publish shortly after the game. That'll be Thursday's show. And then on Friday, we'll look ahead to Wolves-Mavs on Friday night. And again, a tough next week of games for Minnesota, but Suns-Wolves comes first, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So be sure to tune back in for the post-game pod following the game here tonight. Thanks again for those of you that make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. It's greatly appreciated. A reminder to please subscribe on YouTube, to like this video. If you're listening on any of the other platforms, please follow the podcast, subscribe, and leave a review if you enjoy the show. It's definitely appreciated. I can't say thank you enough. Again, it's available everywhere: YouTube, Apple, Google, Spotify, Odyssey. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken, which is with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, Locked On Wolves is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. And while you're making us your first listen, please make your second listen Locked On NBA. It's our Locked On experts that cover the biggest stories around the NBA every Monday through Friday in less than 30 minutes. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.